You think you know betrayal. You think you've seen the face of it, maybe a friend who borrowed money and disappeared, maybe a coworker who took credit for your work. But let me tell you something. Betrayal doesn't knock on your door wearing a mask. It knocks wearing your own blood's face. It smiles with your son's lips. It laughs with your daughter-in-law's voice. And by the time you understand what's happening, you're already sleeping on a cold concrete floor while strangers take your bed. This story. This one right here. It's not a fairy tale. It's not a Hollywood movie where the hero punches the villain and the music swells. No. This is a story about a man named Ethan. A widower. A father. A grandfather who gave everything. And then had to take something back. Not out of hatred. Out of survival. Out of the last ember of self-respect that hadn't been stomped out. Before I tell you what he did, I need you to understand something. Ethan was not a coward. He was not weak. He was the kind of man who held his wife's hand for 3 days while she faded away from cancer. He was the kind of man who worked double shifts as a machinist for 30 years so his son could have new shoes and a bedroom with a door that closed. He was the kind of man who believed that family was everything. And that belief nearly destroyed him. So sit back. Get comfortable. Because this is going to hurt. But I promise you, by the end, you'll stand up a little straighter. Ethan Cole was 58 years old when his wife, Margaret, passed away. That was 3 years before our story begins. Margaret was the quiet kind of strong, the woman who never raised her voice but could silence a room with a single look. She and Ethan had been married for 34 years. They met in high school in Fairview, a small town about an hour outside of Pittsburgh. She was the girl who sat in the back of the library reading poetry, her dark hair falling over her face, her fingers always stained with ink from the pens she chewed on. He was the boy who fixed cars after school and smelled like grease and soap, the one who never quite fit in with the popular crowd but who had a reputation for being the most honest kid in the building. When someone's car broke down on the way to the prom, it was Ethan who stayed up until 2 in the morning getting it running again, and he didn't ask for a single dollar in return. Margaret saw something in him that nobody else did. She saw a heart that was too big for his chest, a heart that would break for strangers and bleed for friends and never, ever learn how to say no to the people he loved. They started dating in the spring of their junior year, and by the time graduation rolled around, everyone in town knew they would end up together. It just took them a few more years to figure it out. Ethan joined the army straight out of high school, did 4 years as a mechanic, and came back with calloused hands and a quiet way of moving through the world. Margaret had waited for him. She hadn't dated anyone else. She had just worked at the hardware store and written him letters every week, sometimes 2 or 3 times a week, long letters filled with the small details of small-town life. Who had gotten married? Who had moved away? What color she had painted her bedroom? When Ethan came home, he went straight to her front door, and he didn't say a word. He just stood there with his duffel bag over his shoulder and his heart in his throat, and Margaret opened the door, looked at him for a long moment, and then pulled him inside. They were married 6 months later at the courthouse because neither of them wanted a big wedding. Margaret wore a simple white dress she had bought off the rack at a department store. Ethan wore his army uniform because he couldn't afford a suit. The reception was in his mother's backyard, with a sheet cake and lemonade and a neighbor who played the guitar. It wasn't fancy. But it was real. They built a life together. A small house on Maple Street in Fairview, not the kind of town you'd find on a postcard, but the kind where neighbors waved and kids played in the street until the streetlights came on and nobody locked their front doors until after 10 o'clock at night. Ethan got a job at the Fairview Metalworks plant, working the second shift, operating a lathe and a milling machine and all the other heavy equipment that turned raw metal into something useful. He came home every night at 11:30, smelling of cutting oil and sweat, and Margaret would have dinner waiting for him, kept warm in the oven. She worked as a bookkeeper at the local hardware store during the day, and in the evening she would sit at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and a stack of receipts, her glasses slipping down her nose, her pen scratching across the paper. They weren't rich. But they were solid. The way a good oak table is solid. They had one son. Mark. Margaret had always wanted a big family, 3 or 4 children, maybe more, but after Mark was born, the doctors said she couldn't have any more. There had been complications. A difficult delivery. A lot of blood. Ethan remembered sitting in the hospital waiting room with his head in his hands, praying to whatever was out there to please let her be okay. She was okay. But the doctor said no more pregnancies. Ethan didn't care. He had Margaret. He had Mark. That was enough. From the beginning, Ethan poured himself into that boy. He wasn't trying to be a perfect father. He didn't even know what a perfect father looked like. His own father had been a hard man who drank too much and spoke too little, a man who had worked himself into an early grave at 53, leaving behind nothing but a small life insurance policy and a set of tools that still smelled like his hands. Ethan had sworn to himself that he would be different. He would be present. He would be patient. He would not let his son grow up wondering whether his father loved him. So he coached Mark's little league team, even though he had never played baseball in his life. He showed up for every parent-teacher conference, even the ones that were just a formality. He helped Mark build a Pinewood Derby car for the Cub Scouts, sanding the wood down to a smooth finish, painting it bright red, putting weights on the back so it would go faster down the track. Mark came in third place that year, and Ethan was prouder than if he had come in first. Late nights helping with algebra even though Ethan had barely passed math himself, sitting at the kitchen table with a pencil behind his ear and a textbook open in front of him, trying to remember formulas he hadn't used in 20 years. He wasn't a perfect father, he worked too much, he was tired too often, and he had a temper that came out in short, sharp bursts when the pressure got too high. Once, when Mark was 14, Ethan yelled at him for forgetting to take out the trash, yelled loud enough that the neighbors probably heard, and Mark didn't speak to him for 3 days. Ethan sat in the garage that night, the same garage that would later become his prison, and cried into his hands because he was so afraid that he was becoming his own father. But he never missed a parent-teacher conference. He never let Mark go to bed hungry. And when Mark crashed the family car at 17, wrapping it around a telephone pole on a rainy night, Ethan didn't yell. He didn't even raise his voice. He just looked at his son, who was standing in the driveway with his shoulders shaking and tears streaming down his face, and he said, "You're alive. That's what matters. The car can be fixed. You can't." And he meant it. That was Ethan. Repairman. Fixer. The guy who held things together. The guy who never, ever walked away. Margaret got sick when Mark was in his second year of community college. Pancreatic cancer. The kind that doesn't ask permission. The kind that moves fast and takes everything. It started with a pain in her side that she thought was just indigestion. Then came the weight loss, the fatigue, the yellowish tint in her eyes that Ethan tried to pretend he didn't notice. By the time the doctors ran the tests, it was already stage 4. It had spread to her liver and her lymph nodes. The oncologist was kind but honest. He didn't use words like cure. He used words like manage and comfort and quality of life. Ethan took leave from work. He slept in a recliner next to her hospital bed for 11 weeks. He learned how to change 4 bags and check blood pressure and read a heart monitor. He held her hair back when the chemotherapy made her sick, and he held her hand when the pain was so bad she couldn't speak, and he held the cup of water to her lips when she was too weak to lift it herself. Mark visited sometimes. Not as often as Ethan would have liked. He was young, and he was scared, and watching his mother fade away was more than he could handle. Ethan understood that. He didn't push. He just sat by Margaret's side, night after night, and talked to her about the old days. About the first time they kissed, behind the bleachers at the high school football game. About the summer they drove to the ocean in Ethan's old truck, sleeping in the bed of the truck under a blanket of stars because they couldn't afford a motel. About the day Mark was born, how Margaret had looked up at Ethan with tears in her eyes and said, "We made a person." And Margaret would smile, even when it hurt to smile, even when her body was betraying her in ways that seemed impossible and cruel. She fought hard. She fought for 11 months. And then, on a Tuesday morning in October, with the autumn leaves falling past the hospital window and the sound of a distant lawnmower drifting through the air, she closed her eyes for the last time. Ethan was holding her hand. He had been holding it for 3 days straight, barely sleeping, barely eating, just holding on like a man clinging to a life raft in the middle of an endless ocean. When the nurse came in and checked for a pulse, she looked at Ethan with gentle eyes and said, "I'm so sorry." And Ethan, big, strong, steady Ethan, did not cry in front of anyone. He thanked the nurse. He called the funeral home. He drove himself home, and he walked through the empty house, and he saw Margaret's reading glasses on the nightstand and her robe hanging on the back of the bathroom door and the half-finished crossword puzzle on the kitchen table. He waited until the funeral was over, 3 days later. He waited until the last casserole dish was washed and returned to its owner. He waited until Mark went back to his apartment, back to his life, back to the world that kept spinning even though Margaret's had stopped. Then he sat in the garage, the same garage that would later become his prison, the same concrete floor and wooden shelves and dusty windows, and he wept until his throat was raw and his eyes were swollen and his entire body felt like it had been hollowed out with a spoon. That was the beginning of the unraveling. Mark dropped out of community college 6 months after his mother died. He said he needed to find himself. He said school wasn't for him. He said he needed some time to figure out what he wanted to do with his life. Ethan didn't argue. He didn't push. He paid off Mark's student loans anyway, $12,000 that should have gone to Ethan's own retirement, $12,000 that represented months and months of double shifts and skipped vacations and brown bag lunches. He told himself it was what Margaret would have wanted. She had always believed in second chances. She had always believed that people could change, could grow, could become better versions of themselves if you just gave them enough time and enough love. Ethan wrote the check with a steady hand, and he mailed it to the loan company, and he didn't mention it to Mark because he didn't want his son to feel guilty. That was his first mistake. Mark drifted through jobs. Retail. Warehouse. A brief, disastrous attempt at selling used cars that lasted exactly 6 weeks and ended with Mark being fired for showing up late 3 days in a row. He moved from apartment to apartment, always one paycheck away from disaster, always calling Ethan for help with the rent or the security deposit or the utility bill that was about to be shut off. And Ethan always said yes. Every single time. Because that was what fathers did. That was what love looked like. And then Mark met Lisa. Lisa was. Well. Let me be kind. Lisa was polished. She wore clothes that cost more than Ethan's monthly mortgage payment. She had a way of smiling that didn't reach her eyes, a way of nodding along while you were speaking that made you feel like she was listening when she was really just waiting for her turn to talk. She had a mother named Brenda who treated Ethan like he was invisible, like he was a piece of furniture that had somehow learned to speak, and a father named Harold who had learned years ago that disagreeing with Brenda wasn't worth the headache. Mark was head over heels inside of 3 months. He talked about Lisa constantly. Her laugh. Her style. Her ambition. He said she was going to do big things someday, that she was too smart for the small town they lived in, that she was going to drag him into a better life whether he liked it or not. Lisa, for her part, seemed to tolerate Mark's affection like someone tolerating a small, yappy dog. She didn't love him. Ethan saw that on day one. He saw it in the way she looked at Mark when Mark wasn't looking back, a flicker of impatience, a hint of condescension, the barely concealed annoyance of someone who was settling for less than she thought she deserved. But Ethan kept his mouth shut. Because what do you say to a son who's already chosen his path? Son, that woman is going to hollow you out like a pumpkin? Mark wouldn't have listened anyway. He was in love. And love, as Ethan knew better than most, is blind and deaf and stubborn as a mule. They got married at the courthouse. No reception. No cake. No flowers. Lisa said weddings were a waste of money that could be spent on a down payment for a house. She said she didn't need a big white dress or a church full of people or any of that traditional nonsense. She wanted something simple. Something efficient. Something that didn't require her to pretend to be happy for longer than 15 minutes. Ethan smiled and wrote them a check for $5,000 anyway. A gift, he said. For their future. For their down payment. For the life they were going to build together. Lisa took the check without saying, "Thank you." Mark hugged Ethan and said, "You're the best, Dad." And that was the last time Mark thanked him for anything. 2 years into the marriage, Mark and Lisa lost their apartment. The landlord evicted them after 3 months of unpaid rent. Lisa had stopped working, something about toxic work environment at the dental office where she'd been a receptionist, something about her boss being unfair and her coworkers being jealous and the whole place being a nightmare of gossip and backstabbing. Mark was working part-time at a warehouse, making barely enough to feed himself, let alone 2 adults. They showed up at Ethan's door on a rainy Sunday evening, standing on the porch with their shoulders hunched against the downpour, suitcases in their hands and desperation in their eyes. Mark looked small. Smaller than Ethan remembered. His face was thinner. His clothes were wrinkled. He looked like a man who hadn't slept well in months, which was probably true. Lisa stood behind him with her arms crossed, her eyes scanning the house like she was already measuring it for new curtains, already deciding where she would put her things and what she would change and how she would make the space her own. "Dad," Mark said. "We need a place to stay. Just for a little while. A few weeks, tops." Ethan opened the door wider. He didn't hesitate. Not for a second. He looked at his son, at the rain dripping off his son's hair, at the exhaustion carved into his son's face, and he felt his heart crack open the way it always did when Mark was in trouble. "Come in," he said. "I'll make up the guest room." The guest room. That was the first mistake. Because once Lisa got inside, the guest room wasn't good enough. The bed was too small. The mattress was too old. The closet was too cramped for her clothes, which seemed to multiply every week. The window faced the street instead of the backyard, which meant she could hear the traffic at night, which meant she couldn't sleep, which meant Mark couldn't sleep either. Lisa sighed a lot. She made comments under her breath, little remarks that were just loud enough to hear but just quiet enough to deny. "I guess it's better than the shelter. At least we're not on the street. It's temporary, right?" Ethan pretended not to hear. He made breakfast every morning: eggs, toast, fresh fruit, coffee, the same thing he had made for Margaret for 34 years. He paid the utility bills without mentioning it, watched the numbers climb higher and higher, felt his savings account shrink a little more each month. He bought extra groceries, extra toilet paper, extra everything. His monthly expenses doubled overnight. He didn't complain. A few weeks turned into 3 months. Then 6. Then a year. Mark stopped looking for better work. He said the economy was bad, that there were no jobs, that he was lucky to have the warehouse gig at all. He spent his evenings watching television on the couch, his afternoons napping, his mornings sleeping in until 10 or 11. Lisa started redecorating: new throw pillows for the couch, new curtains for the kitchen, a new rug in the living room that she charged to Ethan's credit card without asking. She painted the guest bathroom a shade of pale green that she said was calming. She rearranged the furniture in the living room 3 times. She treated the house like it was already hers, like Ethan was just a guest who happened to be living there. And Ethan said nothing. He was afraid that if he said anything, Mark would leave. And deep down, in a place he didn't like to visit, a place that smelled like fear and loneliness, Ethan was terrified of being alone. The house had felt empty after Margaret died. Now it was full of people who made him feel emptier than ever. He would sit in his bedroom at night, his bedroom, the one he had shared with Margaret, and listen to the sounds of the house. Lisa's laugh. Mark's footsteps. The television blaring in the living room. And he would feel like a stranger in his own home. Like a ghost haunting a place that no longer belonged to him. It happened on a Tuesday. Not a dramatic day. Not a holiday. Not an anniversary. Just a regular Tuesday in April, with rain tapping against the windows and the smell of wet earth coming through the screens and the distant rumble of thunder rolling across the sky. Ethan came home from his shift at the hardware store. He'd taken a part-time job after retirement, just to keep busy, just to have somewhere to go during the long empty hours that Margaret used to fill, and found Mark and Lisa sitting at the kitchen table. They were both dressed nice. Lisa had her serious face on, the one she used when she wanted something, the one that said, "I've already made up my mind and you're going to agree with me." Mark looked nervous. He was twisting his hands together under the table, the way he used to do when he was a little boy and he had broken something and he was trying to figure out how to tell his father. "Dad," Mark said. "Sit down. We need to talk." Ethan sat. He poured himself a glass of water from the pitcher. He looked at his son. He looked at his daughter-in-law. He waited. "What's going on?" Lisa spoke first. That was intentional. Mark was the messenger, but Lisa was the message. "My parents are coming to stay with us." Ethan blinked. "Us?" "Yes," Lisa said. "Us. This household. This family." She leaned forward, her elbows on the table, her eyes locked on Ethan's. "They lost their lease. The apartment building got sold to some developer from the city. He's tearing it down to build condos. They have nowhere to go, Ethan. They're family. We can't leave them on the street." Ethan nodded slowly. He understood. He had been a son. He had been a father. He understood what it meant to take care of family. "Of course not," he said. "We'll make room. We can figure something out." "Maybe I can, we already figured it out," Mark interrupted. His voice was tight. He wouldn't look at Ethan. "They need the master bedroom. It's the only room with a private bathroom. Brenda, Lisa's mom, has a condition. A medical condition. She needs to be close to the bathroom at night. She can't be walking down the hallway in the dark. It's not safe." Ethan felt something cold slide down his spine. Something that started at the base of his neck and traveled all the way down to his feet, leaving a trail of ice in its wake. "The master bedroom," he repeated. "That's my room." "We know," Mark said. "But there's no other way. The guest room is too small for 2 people. The basement is damp, and Brenda's doctor said she can't be around mold. So we thought you could take the garage." "The garage?" "Ethan's garage. The place where he kept Margaret's old bicycle, the one she used to ride to the hardware store on summer mornings before the heat set in. The place where his workbench still had the outline of his tools, where he had spent countless hours fixing things, building things, making things work again. The place where he had sat on an overturned bucket and wept after Margaret's funeral, his body shaking with sobs he thought would never end. They wanted him to sleep there. "It's insulated," Mark added quickly. "I checked. There's drywall and insulation and everything. We'll put a space heater. A cot. Some shelves for your things. It'll be fine, Dad. It's just temporary. Just until we find them a place." Lisa smiled. Not a kind smile. A smile that said, "We already decided. You just haven't agreed yet." A smile that said, You're going to say yes because you always say yes. Ethan looked at his son. Mark was 32 years old. He had his mother's eyes, soft, brown, easy to read, eyes that had once sparkled with mischief and wonder and love. But those eyes were looking at the floor now. At the table. At anything except Ethan. Okay, Ethan said quietly. Just for a little while. He didn't sleep well that night. He lay in his bed, for the last time, though he didn't know it yet, and stared at the ceiling, watched the shadows shift as the clouds passed over the moon, listened to the rain tap against the window. The house was quiet. Too quiet. He could hear Mark and Lisa whispering in the next room. Not the words. Just the tone. The tone of people who had already moved on. The tone of people who had already decided that his comfort didn't matter. He thought about Margaret. About what she would say if she could see this. Would she be angry? Would she be sad? Would she tell him to stand up for himself, or would she tell him to be patient and kind and turn the other cheek the way she always had? He didn't know. He had never known. And that uncertainty, that lack of clarity, had been the story of his life for the past 3 years. Ethan woke up at 6 in the morning, the way he always did. His body had been waking up at 6 for 40 years, ever since he started working the early shift at the metalworks plant. He didn't need an alarm clock anymore. His bones knew what time it was. He went to the bathroom. He washed his face with cold water, the way his father had taught him, because cold water wakes you up faster than hot water, because hot water makes you feel comfortable and comfortable makes you slow. He walked to the kitchen to start the coffee, the same ritual he had performed every morning for as long as he could remember. And that's when he saw it. The door to the garage was open. The light was on, casting a pale yellow glow across the concrete floor. And inside the garage, on the cold concrete floor, next to the lawn mower and the stack of old newspapers and the cardboard boxes full of Christmas decorations, was his bed. His mattress. His pillows. His sheets. The quilt that Margaret had sewn by hand, the one with the blue flowers and the slightly crooked stitches, the one she had finished just a week before Mark was born, working by lamplight in the small hours of the morning because she couldn't sleep. His clothes were in trash bags. 3 black trash bags, tied at the top, leaning against the workbench like forgotten luggage. His shoes were lined up in a row like soldiers awaiting orders. His reading glasses were on top of the stack of newspapers. His slippers were next to the lawn mower. Ethan stood there for a long time. His hand was on the doorframe. His breathing was slow and shallow, the way it got when he was trying not to feel something he was definitely feeling. He could hear Lisa's voice from inside the house, laughing. Not a happy laugh. A mean laugh. The kind of laugh that says, finally, the old man knows his place. He heard her say it. Plain as day. Clear as a bell. Finally, the old man knows his place. Ethan closed his eyes. For one terrible moment, he thought about leaving. Just walking out the front door and never coming back. Getting in his truck and driving to the coast, to the ocean he hadn't seen in 20 years, sitting on a bench somewhere and watching the waves until the sun went down and the stars came out and the world forgot he existed. But then he thought about Margaret. About what she would say. She would not say, leave. She would say, stand up. You are not a rug. You are not a doormat. You are not a piece of furniture to be moved around whenever it's convenient. You are a man. Ethan opened his eyes. He looked at his bed in the garage. He looked at the trash bags. He looked at the lawn mower and the newspapers and the familiar, painful sight of his life being reduced to a few square feet of concrete. And he smiled. It was not a happy smile. It was the smile of a man who had just realized something important. The smile of a man who had been pushed too far, stepped on too many times, ignored for too long, and was finally done being kind to people who mistook kindness for weakness. All right, he whispered to himself. All right. Let's see how this plays out. Ethan did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He did not slam doors or throw things or curse or cry or do any of the things that a lesser man might have done in that moment. That's not who he was. He was a machinist. Machinists don't scream at the metal when it doesn't bend the way they want. They measure. They plan. They calculate. They cut with precision. He went back inside the house. Lisa was at the kitchen table, scrolling through her phone, a cup of coffee steaming next to her elbow. Mark was in the shower. Ethan could hear the water running upstairs. Brenda and Harold, Lisa's parents, had not arrived yet. They were coming the next day, driving in from out of state with a U-Haul trailer full of furniture and boxes and all the accumulated stuff of a lifetime. Morning, Ethan, Lisa said without looking up. Hope you don't mind about the garage. We had to move things around to get ready for my parents. Not at all, Ethan said. His voice was calm. Friendly, even. Warm. The way you sound when you're talking to a neighbor you don't particularly like but don't want to be rude to. I was thinking of cleaning out the garage anyway. This gives me a reason to finally get it organized. Lisa looked up. For a split second, something flickered across her face. Doubt? Suspicion? A momentary awareness that maybe, just maybe, she had pushed too hard? But it was gone as fast as it appeared. She shrugged and went back to her phone. Whatever you say, she muttered. Ethan made coffee. He made breakfast, eggs, toast, fresh fruit, the same thing he had made every morning for the past year. He served Mark and Lisa like nothing had changed. He even smiled when Mark said, "Thanks, Dad," and he meant it. He was grateful that Mark still said, "Thanks, Dad," sometimes, even if the words had started to sound hollow. Then he went to the garage. He sat on the edge of his bed, the bed that was now on concrete, the bed that had once been the center of his and Margaret's private world, and he made a list in his head. 1. The house deed was in his name only. Margaret had insisted on that when they bought the place, back in 1987, when they were both young and optimistic and just starting out. Just in case, she had said. You never know what life is going to throw at us. Ethan had thought she was being morbid. Now he understood. She was being wise. 2. The mortgage was paid off. He and Margaret had made the final payment 3 years before she died, a moment of celebration that involved a cheap bottle of sparkling cider and a dinner at the diner downtown. The house was his. Free and clear. No bank. No debt. No one else's name on the title. 3. He had a real estate agent. A woman named Carol who had sold his neighbor's house last year, who had a reputation for being fast and fair and discreet. She could list a property within 24 hours. She could have a closing date within 30 days. 4. He had a bank account that Lisa and Mark didn't know about. It wasn't much, $15,000 from an old life insurance payout, the one he had received after Margaret died and had never touched because it felt wrong to spend money that came from her death. But it was enough. Enough to put a down payment on a small apartment somewhere. Enough to start over. Enough to buy himself a future that didn't include sleeping on concrete. Ethan pulled out his phone. He found Carol's number. He called her. Carol? It's Ethan Cole. I need you to list my house. As is. Cash only. Closing within 30 days. Carol paused. He could hear her breathing, could almost see her face, the surprise, the concern, the unspoken questions. Ethan? Are you okay? You sound different. I'm better than okay, he said. I'm awake. The next 2 weeks were a performance. Ethan became an actor in his own life. He smiled when he wanted to scream. He nodded when he wanted to shake his head. He made small talk when he wanted to sit in silence. He played the role of the agreeable old man, the harmless father, the pushover who would never, ever fight back. And behind the scenes, he worked. He met Carol at a coffee shop on the other side of town, a place where no one knew him, where no one would report back to Mark or Lisa. He signed papers. He initialed pages. He looked at photos of the house that Carol had taken, photos that made the house look warm and inviting, photos that hid the reality of what was happening inside. He found a realtor who specialized in small apartments, a young woman named Denise with bright eyes and a firm handshake. She showed him 7 apartments in 2 days. The first one was too dark. The second one was too small, even smaller than the garage, if you could believe it. The third one was in a bad neighborhood, the kind of place where the windows had bars on them and the front door had 3 deadbolts. The fourth one had a smell that Ethan couldn't identify and didn't want to. The fifth one was perfect. 1 bedroom. Small kitchen. A bathroom with a shower that actually worked. A south-facing window that let in the afternoon sun. It wasn't much. But it was enough. Ethan wrote a check for the security deposit and the first month's rent. He signed a 6-month lease with an option to renew. He bought a bed from a second-hand shop, a twin mattress on a simple metal frame, nothing fancy, just something to sleep on. He bought a table and 2 chairs from a charity shop, $40 total, the kind of table that wobbled if you leaned on it too hard. He bought a set of dishes from a garage sale, mismatched plates and bowls in different colors and patterns, the kind of dishes that didn't match but somehow felt like home. He moved his things in slowly, a few boxes at a time, always when Mark and Lisa were out of the house or asleep. He didn't tell anyone what he was doing. Not because he was ashamed. But because he knew that if Mark found out, Mark would try to talk him out of it. And Ethan didn't want to be talked out of it. He wanted to be free. Lisa's parents arrived on a Thursday. Brenda was a stout woman with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, the kind of woman who had opinions about everything and wasn't afraid to share them. She criticized the paint color in the hallway. She complained about the temperature of the water in the guest bathroom. She rearranged the spices in the kitchen cabinet because she didn't like the way Ethan had organized them. Harold was quiet, too quiet, the kind of man who had learned years ago that disagreeing with Brenda wasn't worth the headache. He spent most of his time on the back porch, reading newspapers and drinking coffee, trying to stay out of the way. They took over the master bedroom immediately. Brenda rearranged the furniture. She moved the dresser to the opposite wall. She put a small table next to the bed for her glasses and her books. She hung a bird feeder outside the window, right where Margaret used to hang hers. Harold brought in his suitcase and his shaving kit and his worn leather slippers, and he put them in the closet next to Brenda's dozens of shoes. They acted like they owned the place. Because, in their minds, they did. Their daughter had told them the house would be theirs soon. The old man won't last much longer, Lisa had said. Ethan overheard her say it. He was standing in the hallway, out of sight, holding a laundry basket full of towels, and he heard her voice drifting through the open door of the master bedroom. He's 61. He's got high blood pressure. He's alone. He'll probably move into a nursing home within a year or two. Then the house is ours, Brenda laughed. Good riddance. I never liked him anyway. Ethan didn't react. He didn't drop the laundry basket. He didn't storm into the room. He just stood there for a moment, feeling the words settle into his chest like stones dropped into deep water. Then he walked back to the garage, set down the laundry basket, and called Carol. Any offers? 3, Carol said. The highest is $240,000. Cash. They want to close in 10 days. Take it. Ethan. Where are you going to live? I already bought a little apartment on the other side of town. 1 bedroom. Small kitchen. South-facing window. That's not much. Ethan looked around the garage. At the lawnmower. At the trash bags. At the bed where he had been sleeping for 2 weeks, waking up every morning with a stiff back and a cold nose and the taste of concrete in his mouth. It's enough, he said. And he meant it. The night before the closing, Ethan cooked a big dinner. Pot roast with carrots and potatoes, the way Margaret used to make it. Mashed potatoes with butter and cream. Green beans from the farmer's market. Fresh bread from the bakery on Main Street. Apple pie for dessert, store-bought because he had never learned how to make pie crust from scratch. Mark was surprised. Dad, what's the occasion? No occasion, Ethan said. Just felt like cooking. It's what your mother would have done. Lisa ate without thanking him. She barely looked at him. She spent most of the meal on her phone, texting someone, laughing at things that weren't funny. Brenda critiqued the potatoes, a little lumpy, but I suppose they'll do, and Harold ate in silence, cleaning his plate and then sitting back with a satisfied sigh. Mark ate quickly, the way he always did, then went to watch television in the living room. After dinner, Ethan cleared the dishes. He washed every plate by hand, the way Margaret used to, because the dishwasher had been broken for years and he had never gotten around to fixing it. He dried them with a dish towel and put them away in the cabinets. He wiped down the counters. He swept the floor. Then he walked through the house one last time. He stood in the master bedroom, his bedroom, the one he had shared with Margaret for 30 years, the room where they had celebrated anniversaries and held each other during thunderstorms and whispered secrets in the dark. Brenda and Harold had gone for a walk around the neighborhood, their footsteps fading into the evening. The room smelled different now. Like perfume and old coffee and something else, something he couldn't identify. Not like Margaret. He touched the wall. The spot where their wedding photo used to hang, right next to the closet door. He had taken it down 2 days ago, along with everything else that mattered, Margaret's jewelry box, her collection of paperback novels, the small porcelain figurine of a bird that she had kept on her nightstand. The photo was in his truck now, wrapped in a blanket, safe from whatever was about to happen. He went to the living room. Mark was asleep on the couch, his mouth open, the television flickering silently. The remote was on the floor. His shoes were kicked off next to the coffee table. He looked young. Younger than 32. He looked like the little boy who used to crawl into Ethan's bed after a nightmare, his thumb in his mouth, his eyes wide with fear. Ethan stood there for a long time. Looking at his son. At the boy he had raised. At the man who had put him in the garage. And then he whispered, so quietly that not even the dog, if they'd had a dog, could have heard him. I forgive you, Mark. I forgive you for all of it. But I won't be your floor anymore. I won't be your doormat. I won't be the person you push aside whenever it's convenient. You have to stand on your own now. Your mother would have wanted that. For both of us. He turned off the television. He covered Mark with a blanket from the back of the couch. Then he went to the garage, picked up his personal safe, his tools, and the small box that held Margaret's ashes. He carried them to his truck in 3 trips, his old knees aching, his back protesting, his heart pounding in his chest. At 2 in the morning, the movers arrived. Ethan had hired a small crew, 2 men and a truck, the same crew that Carol used for her clients. They worked in silence, the way professionals do. They took only what belonged to Ethan. The bed from the garage, the one that had been thrown out like garbage. The trash bags of clothes. The workbench with the outline of his tools. The lawn mower. The box of Margaret's things. Everything else, the furniture, the dishes, the curtains that Lisa had bought with his credit card, the rug she had charged without asking, the new throw pillows she had picked out at the department store, remained. Ethan left one thing behind. An envelope. On the kitchen table, right next to the salt shaker. With Mark's name written in blue ink. Then he got in his truck and drove away. He didn't look back. At 7:50 in the morning, the new owners arrived. A young couple, Sarah and David, both in their early 30s, both with the kind of bright-eyed optimism that comes from having a baby on the way and a future full of possibilities. They had bought the house sight unseen, trusting the photos and Carol's word, trusting that the universe would reward their leap of faith. They had a moving truck, a set of keys, and the biggest smiles Ethan had ever seen. They unlocked the front door. The house was quiet. Too quiet. "Hello?" Sarah called out. No answer. They walked through the living room. The television was off. The blanket that Ethan had put over Mark was on the floor. The couch was empty. They walked through the kitchen. The dishes from last night's dinner were still in the drying rack. The envelope with Mark's name was still on the table. They walked down the hallway. And they found them. Mark, Lisa, Brenda, and Harold in the master bedroom. All 4 of them were still asleep. Lisa was sprawled across the bed like a starfish, her hair fanned out across the pillow, her mouth slightly open. Brenda was snoring, a rhythmic rumble that vibrated through the walls. Harold was curled up in the corner on a small cot, looking like a man who had given up on dignity years ago. David cleared his throat. "Excuse me?" Lisa's eyes snapped open. She saw a stranger standing in the doorway of her bedroom, a man she had never seen before, holding a set of keys and wearing a confused expression. She screamed. Not a little scream. A full-throated, horror movie scream that woke up everyone in the house, that sent birds scattering from the trees outside, that probably woke up the neighbors 2 blocks away. "Who are you? What are you doing in my house?" David held up the keys. He was calm. He had dealt with difficult situations before, he was a paramedic, he had seen things that would make most people weep, and he wasn't about to be intimidated by a woman in her pajamas. "We own this house," he said. "We closed at 8 this morning. The previous owner, a Mr. Ethan Cole, sold it to us. Cash. He said the house would be empty. He said we could move in right away." Brenda sat up. Her hair was a mess, sticking up in all directions. Her face was red, mottled with anger and confusion. "That's ridiculous. My son-in-law owns this house. Ethan was just. He was just staying here. Temporarily. As a favor." Sarah, the new owner, pulled out her phone. She had saved the closing documents, the ones with the signatures and the notary stamps and the legal language that made everything official. She held the phone up so Brenda could see. "Mr. Cole signed these papers yesterday afternoon. The deed transferred this morning at 8 o'clock. I'm sorry, but you're going to have to leave. This isn't your home anymore." Mark stumbled into the room, rubbing his eyes, his hair sticking up, his shirt untucked. He was wearing the same clothes from last night, the jeans and the flannel shirt that he had fallen asleep in on the couch. "What's going on? Why are there strangers in the house?" Lisa turned on him. Her eyes were wild, unfocused, the eyes of someone who had just realized that the ground beneath her feet wasn't as solid as she thought. "Your father sold the house. While we were sleeping. He sold it out from under us." Mark's face went pale. The color drained out of him like water out of a cracked jug. No. No, that's not possible. He wouldn't. He wouldn't do that to me. He's my father. He loves me." "He did," David said. "I have the papers right here. You can call the police if you want. You can call a lawyer. You can call whoever you want. But they're going to tell you the same thing. This isn't your house. It hasn't been your house for the past hour. You need to pack your things and go." Harold finally spoke. His voice was quiet. Tired. The voice of a man who had seen this coming, who had tried to warn his wife, who had been ignored. "I told you, Brenda. I told you this would happen. You can't push a man out of his own bed and expect him to stay quiet. You can't treat people like furniture and expect them not to fight back," Brenda snapped at him. "Shut up, Harold. Just shut up for once in your life." But Harold didn't shut up. He got up from his cot. He put on his slippers. He walked to the kitchen, moving slowly, the way old men move when their joints ache. He found the envelope on the table, the one with Mark's name on it, and he brought it back to the bedroom. He handed it to Mark without a word. Mark opened the envelope. His hands were shaking. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded in thirds. In Ethan's handwriting, slightly shaky, the way old hands get when they've worked with metal for too long, when the fingers don't always do exactly what the brain tells them to do. This is what it said: Mark, you wanted me out of your life. Now you are out of my house. The mortgage was paid by me. The down payment was your mother's life insurance. You chose a woman who couldn't respect the man who changed your diapers. I forgive you. But I will not fund your disrespect. Find your own way. Dad. Mark read the letter 3 times. He read it once, and the words didn't make sense. He read it twice, and they started to sink in. He read it 3 times, and he felt something crack inside his chest, something that had been hardening for years, something that he hadn't even known was there until it broke. Then he sat down on the floor of the master bedroom, his mother's bedroom, the room where she had slept and dreamed and raised him, and he didn't say a word. He just sat there, holding the paper, while Lisa screamed at David and Sarah, while Brenda called Ethan every name she could think of, while Harold packed a single bag and walked out the front door without looking back. The police arrived 20 minutes later. Not to arrest anyone, the sale was perfectly legal, the eviction was perfectly legal, everything Ethan had done was perfectly legal, but to escort them off the property. By noon, Mark, Lisa, and Brenda were standing on the sidewalk with a pile of trash bags and a broken air conditioner. They had nowhere to go. The weekly motel on the other side of town. The one with the flickering neon sign and the doors that didn't lock properly. That was their future now. Ethan, meanwhile, was sitting in his new apartment. 1 bedroom. Small kitchen. South-facing window. He was drinking a glass of cold water, watching the afternoon light slant across the floor, listening to the sound of a lawnmower somewhere in the distance. And for the first time in 2 years, Ethan Cole was smiling a real smile. That first night in the apartment, Ethan sat at the small kitchen table. The table was second-hand, he'd bought it from a charity shop for $40, the same shop where he had bought most of his new things. The chair creaked when he leaned back, a high-pitched squeak that would probably drive him crazy after a while. The refrigerator hummed, a low vibration that he could feel through the floor. The traffic outside was quiet, just the occasional car passing by, the occasional dog barking somewhere in the distance. He took out Margaret's photo. The one from their wedding day. She was 22 years old, wearing that simple white dress, her dark hair piled up on her head in a way that took her hours to achieve. She was laughing at something Ethan had said, something stupid, probably. He was good at making her laugh. It was one of the few things he was truly good at. Well, Maggie, he said aloud. I did it. I finally stood up. He set the photo on the table, propped against the salt shaker so she could see the room. He made himself a simple dinner, a sandwich with turkey and cheese, some apple slices, a glass of milk. He ate slowly, chewing each bite, savoring the taste. He washed the dishes. He dried them. He put them away in the cabinets. Then he walked to the window. The south-facing window. The one that caught the last light of the evening, the golden hour light that made everything look softer, gentler, more forgiving. The sky was orange and pink, streaked with clouds that looked like brushstrokes on a canvas. Somewhere out there, beyond the rooftops and the treetops and the distant hills, the sun was setting on the house on Maple Street. The house where he had raised his son. The house where his wife had died. The house where he had been pushed into a garage like an old piece of furniture. He didn't feel sad. He didn't feel angry. He felt light. Like someone had removed a heavy coat he'd been wearing for years without realizing it. Like someone had opened a window in a stuffy room and let in a breeze. He thought about Mark. About the letter. About the look on his son's face when he read the words "find your own way." He wondered if Mark would ever understand. Probably not. Some lessons take years to land. Some never land at all. He thought about Lisa. About her laugh. About the way she said finally, "The old man knows his place." He wondered where she was sleeping tonight. He didn't wish her harm. He just wished her silence. He thought about Brenda. About her sharp eyes and sharper tongue. About the way she had taken his bedroom without a single word of thanks, without a single acknowledgement that she was sleeping in a dead woman's room. He wondered if she would ever apologize. He doubted it. Some people don't have the capacity for shame. And then he thought about himself. About the man he had been and the man he was becoming. He had spent so many years being kind. Being patient. Being the doormat. And somewhere along the way, he had confused endurance with virtue. He had told himself that turning the other cheek was the same as being strong. But it wasn't. Not always. Sometimes strength looked like a quiet man selling his own house while his son slept. Sometimes strength looked like a father walking away, not because he didn't love, but because he loved too much to watch himself be destroyed. Ethan took a deep breath. He wiped his eyes, they were wet, though he hadn't noticed when it started, when the tears had begun to fall. "I'm sorry, Mark," he whispered. "I'm sorry it had to be this way. But I'm not sorry I did it. I'm not sorry I chose myself for once." He went to bed early. The bed was small, a twin mattress on a simple metal frame, the same one he had bought from the second-hand shop, but it was his. Not the garage floor. Not a cot. Not a place that smelled like gasoline and old newspapers and the ghosts of everything he had lost. He pulled the blue flowered quilt up to his chin. The same quilt that Margaret had sewn, the same quilt that had been thrown into the garage like garbage, the same quilt that had kept him warm on countless nights. He closed his eyes. And for the first time in 2 years, Ethan Cole slept like a baby. No nightmares. No stiffness. No shame. Just peace. 3 months passed. The seasons changed from spring to summer. The apartment got hot in the afternoons, the sun beating through the south-facing window, but Ethan didn't mind. He bought a small fan from the hardware store and pointed it at his chair, letting the breeze ruffle his hair while he read his books. He planted a tomato plant on the balcony, a single pot, a single plant, a single green shoot that grew taller and stronger every day, like it was trying to prove something. He got a library card. He started reading again, something he hadn't done since Margaret died. Mysteries. Westerns. Books about men who faced impossible odds and somehow found a way through. He read slowly, savoring every page, because he had learned that time was not something to be wasted. He heard from Carol that Mark and Lisa had moved into a weekly motel on the other side of town. The kind with flickering neon signs and doors that didn't lock properly and a smell that never quite went away no matter how much they cleaned. Brenda had moved back to her sister's house in another state, taking Harold with her. Harold had filed for separation, quiet Harold, the man who never spoke, the man who had spent 40 years nodding along and keeping his head down, had finally had enough. Ethan didn't gloat. He didn't call. He didn't drive past the motel to see for himself. He just sat on his balcony, watched his tomato plant grow, and thought about the nature of consequences. One evening, his phone rang. A number he didn't recognize. He almost didn't answer. But something told him to pick up. "Hello?" Silence. Then a voice. Mark's voice. But smaller. Thinner. Softer. Like a version of Mark that had been through a washing machine and come out faded, wrung out, barely recognizable. "Dad?" Ethan didn't say anything for a long moment. He looked at the tomato plant. He looked at the sky, which was turning purple and gold in the fading light. He looked at Margaret's photo on the table, the one from their wedding day, the one where she was laughing. "I'm here, son." Mark started to cry. Not the quiet kind of crying that men do when they think no one is watching. The loud kind. The kind that comes from a place so deep it hurts to breathe, the kind that shakes your whole body, the kind that makes you feel like you're falling apart and you don't know how to put yourself back together. "Dad, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I didn't realize what I was doing. Lisa said, she told me it was temporary. She told me you wouldn't mind. She told me you were old and you didn't need the space and you wouldn't even notice, and I believed her because I wanted to believe her. Because it was easier than standing up to her. Because I was scared, Dad. I was scared of losing her. I was scared of being alone. And I didn't see what I was doing to you. I didn't see that I was losing you too. Dad, I'm so sorry." Ethan listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't try to stop the tears. He let Mark cry. He let the words come out in pieces, like broken glass being swept off a floor, like shards of something that used to be whole. When Mark finally stopped, when the sobs had quieted to hiccups and the hiccups had quieted to silence, Ethan spoke. His voice was calm. Not cold. Not warm. Just real. "Mark, I love you. You are my son. Nothing will ever change that. Not the garage. Not Lisa. Not any of it." "Then why did you let me finish?" Ethan said. "I love you. But love does not mean letting someone destroy you. Love does not mean sleeping on a concrete floor while your son's wife laughs at you. Love does not mean being treated like garbage in your own home. Love does not mean being invisible." Mark was quiet. Ethan could hear him breathing, could hear the faint sound of traffic in the background. "I sold the house because I had to save myself," Ethan continued. "Not to punish you. Not to get revenge. Not to hurt you. Because if I had stayed, if I had kept letting you and Lisa and her parents push me around, I would have stopped being a man. I would have become a ghost. A shadow. A piece of furniture. And your mother didn't raise a ghost. Your mother raised a man who knows his own worth. What do I do now? Mark whispered. That's not for me to answer, Ethan said. You're a grown man. 32 years old. You have to figure it out on your own. But I'll tell you this. You can't build a life on someone else's back. You can't build a future on someone else's sacrifice. You have to stand on your own 2 feet. And if Lisa won't let you do that, then maybe you need to ask yourself whether she's helping you stand or pushing you down. More silence. Then Mark said something that made Ethan's heart ache, that made his eyes fill with tears he didn't bother to wipe away. She left, Dad. Last week. She took the car and the little bit of money we had left in the bank account. She said I was a failure. She said her mother was right about me. She said I would never amount to anything. Ethan closed his eyes. He remembered the day he first met Lisa, the way she had looked at Mark like he was a meal ticket, not a husband. He remembered the smile that didn't reach her eyes. He remembered the way she had laughed when Ethan was moved to the garage. I'm sorry, son. I know that hurts. It does, Mark said. But you know what? It also feels lighter. Like I don't have to pretend anymore. Like I don't have to be someone I'm not. Like I can finally just be me. Ethan smiled. A small smile. A tired smile. But a real one. That's called waking up, Mark. It hurts. But it's better than sleeping through your whole life. 6 months later, Mark showed up at Ethan's apartment door. He was thinner. His clothes were worn, clean but faded, the kind of clothes that had been washed too many times. His hands were rough, calloused from work. But his eyes were different. Clearer. Steadier. The eyes of a man who had been through something and come out the other side. Dad, he said. I'm not here to ask for anything. I just wanted to see you. To tell you I understand now. What you did. Why you did it. Ethan stepped aside. Come in. I made coffee. They sat at the small kitchen table. The same table from the charity shop. The same creaky chair. The same salt shaker propping up Margaret's photo. Mark looked around the apartment, the bare walls, the single tomato plant on the balcony, the stack of library books on the counter, the small fan humming in the corner. It's small, Mark said. It's enough, Ethan replied. They drank their coffee in silence for a while. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who had been through a war together and were still figuring out how to be peaceful. Then Mark spoke again. I'm not going to ask to move in. I'm not going to ask for money. I'm not going to ask for anything except. I missed you, Dad. And I wanted to say sorry. For real. Not just with words. With my life. I'm going to show you. From now on, I'm going to show you. Ethan reached across the table. He put his hand on his son's hand. The same hand that had changed Mark's diapers. The same hand that had taught him to ride a bike. The same hand that had held Margaret's as she slipped away. The same hand that had signed the papers to sell the house. I know, son, he said. I already see it. They didn't hug. They weren't that kind of family. But they sat at that small table for a long time, watching the sun go down through the south-facing window, watching the sky turn orange and pink and purple, watching the tomato plant cast long shadows across the balcony. And somewhere in the quiet, something healed. Not completely. Not overnight. But a crack closed. A wound began to scar. A bridge was rebuilt, not with grand gestures or dramatic speeches, but with coffee and silence and 2 men who had finally learned to be honest with each other. And Ethan realized something. Something that had been growing in his chest for months, something that he hadn't been able to put into words until this very moment. Revenge, if you could even call it that, had never been the point. The point was dignity. The point was a man refusing to be erased. The point was a father who loved his son enough to walk away, so that his son might one day learn to walk on his own. The point was not to destroy. The point was to build. To build a new life from the rubble of the old one. To build a future where no one slept on concrete. To build a relationship based on respect instead of obligation. Ethan looked at his son. Mark was looking out the window, watching the last light fade from the sky. He looked peaceful. Not happy, exactly. But peaceful. And for a man who had been through what Mark had been through, peace was more than enough. You know, Ethan said, breaking the silence, your mother would be proud of you. Mark turned to look at him. His eyes were wet. You think so? I know so, Ethan said. She always believed in you. Even when you didn't believe in yourself. Even when you made mistakes. She never stopped believing. Mark nodded. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. I miss her, Dad. I know, son. I miss her too. Every day. They sat in silence again. The darkness gathered outside the window. The fan hummed. The refrigerator clicked on and off. 2 men, a small apartment, a tomato plant, and a memory of a woman who had loved them both. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. There were no fireworks, no standing ovations, no dramatic reconciliations. But it was real. And real, Ethan had learned, was better than perfect. Because perfect didn't exist. Perfect was a lie people told themselves to avoid the messiness of actually living. But real? Real was sitting at a wobbly table with your son, drinking coffee that was slightly too strong, and feeling, for the first time in years, like you were exactly where you were supposed to be. Ethan thought about the garage. About the concrete floor. About the trash bags full of his clothes. About the sound of Lisa's laugh. He thought about the envelope he had left on the kitchen table. About the words he had written. About the look on Mark's face when he read them. And he felt something he hadn't expected to feel. Not satisfaction. Not triumph. Not even relief. He felt sadness. A deep, quiet sadness for everything that had been lost, for the years that had been wasted, for the love that had been buried under pride and stubbornness and fear. But underneath the sadness, there was something else. Something softer. Something like hope. Because Mark was here. Because the door wasn't closed. Because even after everything, after the garage and the betrayal and the sale and the eviction, they were still father and son. And that, Ethan realized, was the real victory. Not revenge. Not punishment. Not making someone pay. It was the ability to forgive, to rebuild. To sit at a wobbly table with someone who had hurt you and say, I love you anyway. That was courage. That was strength. That was the kind of man Ethan had always wanted to be. And he was. So here we are at the end of the story. And I want you to sit with this for a moment. Ethan didn't destroy his son. He didn't curse him. He didn't call down fire from the sky. He simply refused to be invisible anymore. And in doing so, he gave his son something far more valuable than a house or a bedroom or a garage. He gave him the truth. The truth that love without boundaries is not love. The truth that family is not about who sleeps in the master bedroom. The truth that a man's worth cannot be measured by how much he is willing to sacrifice for people who would never sacrifice for him. Ethan felt the pain of what he did. He didn't walk away laughing. He walked away with tears in his eyes and a crack in his heart. But he walked away. And sometimes, walking away is the bravest thing a person can do. Sometimes, saying no is the most loving word you can speak. Sometimes, selling the house while they sleep is not an act of cruelty. It is an act of survival. And survival, my friends, is the oldest kind of courage there is. So if you take anything from this story, take this: you are not a doormat. You are not a piece of furniture. You are not invisible. And the people who treat you like you are? They don't deserve the privilege of your presence. Stand up. Walk away. Build something new. Because the world needs more men like Ethan, not men who seek revenge, but men who seek dignity. And dignity, once found, is the sweetest victory of all.